Gradient boosting trees. Where did it get that name from? Well, boosting we understand because boosting just means an ensemble model that's going to take weak learners and configure them to generate a strong learner. But what about the gradient part? Where does that come into when we talked about the model, when we created our model, we expanded it to include these trees? Well, we saw a derivative with respect to this idea of pseudo-residuals. Remember, we took the derivative of our loss function with respect to the model. We use that to generate our pseudo-residuals. So maybe that's where the name gradient is coming to play. Let's go ahead and give you a more concrete example of where it's getting this name gradient from, or why is it called gradient boosting trees? Well, let's talk about gradient descent. Let's do a recap on gradient descent. We'll see how gradient descent, how it can make an analogy to what we're doing with gradient boosting trees. Now, gradient descent is a minimization algorithm, or an optimization algorithm, in which we're going to update and improve our current answer by taking a step in the direction of the negative of the gradient of the function that we're trying to minimize. In other words, we are in this search space. So let me draw it out here. So let's say we have a two-dimensional space. Of course, we can have any number of dimensional space. We have a two-dimensional space, x1 and x2. And we're trying to find the minimum of our function. So our function has parameters x1 and x2. What are the best x1 and x2 values that are going to minimize this function? And the way we go about searching through this space is we start off at a point here, or some random point, and we take the gradient of our function, of our cost function, whatever function we're trying to minimize. And the reason why we take the gradient is because we understand the gradient is going to tell us the direction of greatest ascent, and the negative of that direction will tell us the direction of greatest descent. So this is a greedy algorithm in which we're going to make the locally optimal choice. In other words, where I am now, which direction should I step towards that's going to get me the greatest reduction in this cost function? And then I take a step in that direction of a given step size. And then at that new place, then I repeat the process. Okay, where I am currently, which direction should I step towards is going to result in the greatest reduction of the cost function. Then take a step in that direction. And I repeat the process, and hopefully I will converge to the global minimum. So that's in a nutshell what's happening in gradient descent. Let's contrast that, or not contrast it, but let's go ahead and compare that what we're doing with gradient boosting trees. With the gradient boosting trees, we had a very simple model to begin with. In this case, it was a mean regressor when we're doing regression. And then we said, okay, let me add a new decision tree model. I'm going to add a new decision tree model. It's going to be trained on the pseudo-residuals. And I'm going to scale that tree's contribution by this parameter called gamma. So I trained my model on the pseudo-residuals, and I scaled its contribution to update my model. So with gradient descent, we can say our updated value of our coefficients. Let's say we're searching through modifying betas. So this is n plus 1, and this is n. So n here just represents the number of iterations, what iteration we are at. So this is our gradient descent model. And what we're doing in gradient boosting trees is that we have a new model that's based upon the old model plus the new model. This was trained on, sorry, this right here is my h of m of x. And remember, this right here, the new model h of m, was trained on the pseudo-residuals. So notice how this is very analogous. And what the pseudo-residuals represent, it represents the direction of the greatest reduction in our prediction error. So it is our estimate of the gradient if we were to view this as basically applying gradient descent. What we're doing here with gradient boosting trees is we're doing gradient descent. We're taking the derivative, so we're figuring out what is the direction. We're trying to figure out what is the best direction that's going to further reduce the error of my model. That direction is going to manifest itself as that new model that I'm adding to the overall model. And that step size that I apply in gradient descent, that step size, it's analogous to this gamma coefficient. Remember what I said about that gamma coefficient, what it represents? It represents how much should that new model contribute to the updated model. And that's what step size tells you. How big of a step should we take in that direction? So in some sense, as we grow our tree, we're adding more and more trees. We're simply adding more iterations. We're applying more iterations in this view of gradient descent. Now let's talk about some of the key hyperparameters for our gradient boosting tree. So apart with the hyperparameters we saw before with standard decision trees, this idea of max step, min samples leaf, things like that, the error metric you can use. We also have the number of estimators. We can choose how many trees we're going to have. So how many, if you want to view it, how many iterations of gradient descent we're going to apply. Apart from those hyperparameters, we have two additional specific ones for gradient boosting trees. One of them is the learning rate. And this is going to be a multiplicative factor of the tree's contribution to the model. So we can further modify the step size. So this is the equation of our gradient boosting tree with that learning parameter, that learning rate. So nu is that learning rate parameter. So we can further change the new model's contribution to the overall model. And we can also apply subsampling, which is a fraction of training data used when fitting the trees. If we don't apply subsampling, what happens is that at each tree that we train on the full training set. However, we have control over saying maybe not train the new trees on the full data set. Go in and apply some subsampling. Train it on maybe only a portion of the data set. Let's say maybe half of the data set or 20% of the data set. We can go ahead and apply subsampling. So let's explore the effect of playing around with these two hyperparameters, learning rate and subsampling. These are the two new hyperparameters for gradient boosting trees. Let's get an idea of how they interact with each other. Let's get a good idea so we can have some guidance when we go about tuning these models. Okay, so we have this function here. What we're going to do here is we're going to generate different curves for the mean square root error with different learning rates. So let's see the behavior. Okay. All right, so this is the behavior here. So we have 4 curves with 4 different combinations of the learning rate and subsampling. So what do you guys observe in this plot here? What do you observe, and how is that similar to the curve we saw before for random forest? We saw the same behavior where we increase the number of trees. There's a big drop, a precipitous drop in error. We saw that behavior, the same thing with random forest. And we also see that the whole idea is we increase the number of trees. In general, that will lead to lower and lower error, but it tends to plateau. So at a certain point, we've converged to the minimum value is one way to view it. The other thing we see here is that there might be some overfitting as we increase the number of trees. But this overfitting isn't so drastic. So for example, if we examine the blue curve here, it looks like it reaches a minimum about 40. As we go beyond 40, the error increases. But that increase of error isn't so drastic. So we have, it's a robust to overfitting as we increase the number of trees. Yes, you can overfit as you increase the number of trees, but in general, the extent of that overfitting won't be so drastic. In other words, we don't have something like this. We'll have something that's maybe like this. But of course, we want our model to be as simple as possible, because if we're able to use less trees, then the training times, prediction times will be a lot faster for these models. So there is an incentive to reduce the number of trees, the number of estimators we are using in our ensemble. Now let's examine this plot further. So the worst curve was the green one. If you look at this worst curve, we notice it has a learning rate of 1 and a subsampling rate of 0.5. In other words, we're not going to further reduce the tree's contribution. So new is set to 1, so sort of the standard model. And we apply subsampling. And what we see here is that if you're going to apply subsampling, you need to modify the learning rate. If you're going to subsample, you need to drop the learning rate. You're going to get a poor performance if you subsample but don't affect the learning rate. And in general, the smaller the learning rate results in a need of more trees, and it allows the model to slowly converge and increase the size of the leaves. Okay, now let's examine the blue and the red. So the blue and red represent a situation in which notice there, red here, so we reduced the learning rate, we applied subsampling, so that was better. And the blue one is in which we had sort of the standard learning rate was 1 and subsampling rate was 1. To have very similar performance. But from these four curves, the one that had the best performance was one in which we applied subsampling and reduced the learning rate. In fact, if we look at this here, it appears that we can still increase the number of trees and still have a model that further reduces the test error. Doesn't appear to have reached the minimum yet. And let's make sense of this plateau behavior. Why do we drop an error very drastically, but why do we tend to plateau? Let's go back and answer this question by viewing this model as essentially gradient descent. In gradient descent, eventually, after any number of iterations, ideally, you are going to reach some minimum value. So once you reach that minimum value, you're kind of stuck there. Further steps aren't going to improve your overall answer. You found some minimum value. Ideally, that's going to be the global minimum, but you might have found a local minimum that you're sort of stuck at. So any further iterations aren't going to really improve the final answer. Similar thing what's happening here. As we increase the number of trees, we sort of exhausted the model's ability to fit to the data, to learn the signal of the data. So adding any of these new trees, so adding more iterations, isn't going to further improve on our answer. Let's go ahead and answer this question here. If you have a model that has high variance error, how should you modify the values of the subsampling fraction and their learning rate to reduce variance? So if you want to reduce variance, you want to play around with the learning rate and the subsampling rate. So why is decreasing our subsample fraction, why is that going to reduce the variance of our model? Well, if you subsample, in other words, you give each tree a portion of the training data, you're less susceptible to overfitting, since you're not going to give all the observations that are possible. So the model is going to be less prone to overfitting. So that is why subsampling reducing the subsampling, or basically applying subsampling, is going to reduce variance error. And the learning rate is going to scale the contributions, further reduce each tree's contribution to the overall model. It's going to range from 0 and 1. Values for learning rate are going to scale from 0 and 1. Subsampling rate is going to scale from 0 and 1. You can view them as representing fractions. So by reducing the learning rate, the model is going to slowly converge to the answer. So the idea of slowly conversion will go ahead and help us with regards to overfitting. So we're going to reduce variance error when we reduce the learning rate. So when you set a learning rate less than 1.